Good afternoon, and welcome to all conference participants who've chosen this parallel session on leadership context, culture, and identity. Certainly context and culture are well-known associated concepts when considering leadership. Identity, not so much, but we will see how the discussion goes. I'd like to introduce our three discussants or panelists out front so that after that, the discussion may flow as it will and as it wishes. Our first discussant will be Dr. Carolyn Stefanko. She's a global higher education and women's leadership expert. Following 2 decades as a tenured professor of history, she served as dean, vice president, and president in both public and private universities in the United States. She now works as senior vice president for Lindea Global and also offers executive coaching through her own consultancy to leaders who want to improve their performance and advance their careers. There is a fuller resume available on the menu. We will then go to Prof. Thandwa Matembu. Thandwa, you can appear should you so wish while I introduce you. Thandwa Matembu was appointed Vice Chancellor and Principal of Durban University of Technology, DUT, in 1st of October 2016. He has a total of about 25 years of university executive management experience. In fact, we briefly coincided at one point, sometime in the past, on the WITS executive. And before joining DUT about 4 years ago, he was then Vice Chancellor of another university, that's the Central University of Technology. Before then, he served in various positions, such as the DVC and Vice Principal at WITS, which I've mentioned, and he's a mathematician. Professor Pamela Dube. Pamela Dube was appointed at UWC as Deputy Vice Chancellor, Student Development and Support in 2015. Before joining UWC, she served as Dean of Students at the University of the Witwatersrand. Her research background is in the field of literature and media studies. She has published a range of internationally recognized publications with a special focus on gender issues, post-colonial literature, and the oral tradition, as well as on the broader media. Welcome to you, Pamela, and to all the panelists. So without further ado, to kick off our dialogic and generative discussion, I'm going to ask Dr. Carolyn Stefanko to, at least metaphorically, ascend the presidium and make her contribution.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's wonderful to be with all of you. As Patrick said, most of my career in higher education has been as a tenured faculty member, and then I became an academic administrator and recently retired as a president. And all of those positions have mostly been in the United States. But I've also lived and worked in England and in Croatia and in Bulgaria. And I have initiated partnerships with institutions across the globe in countries ranging from Vietnam to Australia, and yes, even South Africa. So my perspective has definitely been shaped by global experiences. In fact, along with advancing women's leadership, the goal of global engagement was probably most significant in my most recent university leadership experience. So I'd like to use this global engagement as a lens today for thinking about how we understand and attempt to transform institutional cultures and identities, and the global challenges we face in higher education, especially after COVID. So at my last institution, which was in the state of New York in the US, we enrolled a majority of students who were first-generation college students, who were from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and or who were students of color. Global connectedness was the first goal of our strategic plan that guided our focus on institutional transformation. My institution had had a long history, going back about 50 years, of recruiting student athletes from other countries. But I think to some extent that was about winning, and it really wasn't part of an intentional global strategy. And we really didn't have much understanding or focus on how a 21st century education really must be a global education in order for our students to be successful. Rather than prioritizing study abroad, which many institutions in the US do, and they crow about the percentage of students who leave for a semester or for a year to study in another country, we recognize that this really wasn't a realistic option for most of our students. They couldn't afford it. They had small children. They were working for a variety of reasons. And so instead, we focused on international student recruitment. In the Office of Admissions, we hired more and more experienced staff to recruit students to both our undergraduate and our graduate programs. And by the time my presidency concluded, we had students from 70 countries on campus. Now, to ensure that they were successful and to realize the goal of providing a global education to all students, our international students as well as our domestic students, we also had to change the culture. So similar in the focus from diversity to inclusion, we weren't just interested in numbers of students or numbers of countries. We were really focused on creating a sense of belonging for all students on campus. We did this in a variety of ways. First of all, through creating spaces. We opened a standalone new building to house the Office of International Programs. And this building really became a beacon of our commitment and also as a physical space, a place where all the people who worked in international education and programs had their offices, where students had a computer lab, where there were gathering spaces for students who were international, but also domestic to come together in a living room type, atmosphere, and also a kitchen. And it turns out that the kitchen was probably the most important part of this building, because for many students who are not allowed to cook in their residence hall rooms, this was a place where they could purchase food, they could prepare meals that were like the foods that they ate from home. And also on many occasions that I was fortunate enough to share, they could invite others to share in those meals. We also created new programs. So for example, while all students, no matter where they came from, had the typical new student orientation, we decided that our international students needed more than that. And so they came a few days before new domestic students. And that gave them more time to get settled, to get used to the time zone, and gave us an opportunity to do things for them that a lot of domestic students didn't need. For example, many of our domestic students were able to begin, moving into their residence hall rooms with items that they brought from home because they were traveling by car, or even if they were traveling by plane to us, they were able to ship things more easily. But for international students, they moved into their rooms and they pretty much had a bed, a frame, and a mattress, and a dresser, and a closet. And they needed to buy things. And so we actually needed to make sure that they had a lamp and other kinds of items like that. We also created scholarships. We raised money from donors to make up the difference between institutional financial aid and the actual cost of attendance. And for many of our international students who have difficulty working, that was really essential, and that relieved a burden for them. We created symbols, and I will tell you that one of the ways I have grown in my leadership over time is in understanding much more deeply the importance of symbols. So we purchased flags of the countries of all of our students. And when it came to graduation, in other words, commencement, instead of only having the US flag on the stage, we had the flag from every student's country of origin who happened to be graduating as part of that ceremony. This provided a really beautiful backdrop, and it reflected who we were and what we valued. We created professional development opportunities for faculty and staff. And this was important because, of course, our definition of diversity was broader than just domestic students of color. We really needed to shift our mindsets from teaching who we were used to teaching or who we wanted to be teaching to teaching who actually was in front of us in the practice room or the lab or the classroom. And so we brought in speakers, we held workshops, we brought in outside consultants, and we looked for faculty champions to work with us, to lead us in this work. We created a presence for international students. We worked with them to transform existing student clubs so that they actually would be better in terms of meeting the needs of international students. International students themselves started their own organization. And with funding from the university, they offered cultural events that celebrated who they were and also helped to educate others. We made sure that international students were represented in student government and in institutional task forces, and that they had the opportunity to meet with university leaders. So I was very involved with international students. I would show up at their events. But for example, when we had a dinner for our trustees, we made sure that at every small round table in the restaurant, large banquet type room, we had an international student at every one of the tables so that the international students got to know our trustees and the trustees got to appreciate the perspective of international students. Now, sadly, when the pandemic began, of course, everything changed. Most US institutions of higher education sent all students home, or that's what we said we were doing. And we had a few days notice as we began that process. And of course, we tried to move all instruction online. New York, the state that I was living in, and New York City as well, were especially hard hit by the pandemic and in its first wave in the US. Most international students, however, on our campus could not go home, either due to border closures, to the lack of resources to purchase plane tickets with almost no notice, and also because of their own fears and the fears of their family members that the virus was worse in their countries of origin and that they might be better off staying in the US. So they found themselves living on campus, but taking classes online. Their residential life experiences disappeared. The health center, the library, and most offices closed as staff worked remotely as well. No cafeterias were open. So we quickly figured out that in order for them to eat, we needed to deliver food to their rooms. And after we got past the initial crisis of moving thousands of students out, sending employees home, and trying to teach online without much training or preparation, my colleagues in international education and I realized that those left behind, the international students, were really suffering. They were afraid, they didn't know what their future held, they were isolated, and they were lonely. And while the unprecedented times through which we are living did not give us much time or resources to fully meet their needs, the work we had been doing over the past years in the previous time period in terms of privileging global engagement and creating an inclusive community where international students were welcome and the differences they brought to our community were valued, enabled us, I believe, to more quickly realize, more quickly than other institutions, that our international students had literally been left behind and we needed to do more to support them. So my colleague, Dr. Alfredo Varela, who was the Associate Vice President for International Programs, and I published an article about what we did. We recommended that we survey international students, and we did do that ourselves, and we recommended that other institutions do this to better understand their needs. In other words, not just make assumptions. We advocated for new processes for student visas, and we believe that a change in the US presidential administration will help here. We utilized higher education networks, and we advocated that others do so as well, like this one that I have the privilege of participating in today, to discuss and to advocate for international education and international students. We worked further to increase financial aid, because we knew that the impact of the pandemic on family and student income had reduced international students' ability to pay for even a portion of their education. For students who did make it home, we knew that they would have difficulty returning. So we tried to create new partnerships in other countries for online degrees to help students to be able to finish the educations that they had started. And in the US, we have a program called OPT. It's referred to with that acronym of, it's about optional practical training. It's one of the reasons that many international students have chosen to come to the US because of that year after they graduate where they can serve in an internship or work before they go home. And those kinds of opportunities were severely impacted by the pandemic as businesses in the US suffered. It was much harder for international students to find jobs and internships and be able to stay for those who were graduating. And so we redoubled our efforts to try to find places for them, even if they were places at our own institution. So the big question for me is, how can we, given these unprecedented times in which we're living, how can we continue to advocate for the inclusive communities that we say that we really value? And how can we make a place for international students and education as we continue to prioritize it as one of our goals? So these types of recommendations that my colleague and I made in the article we published, and which reflect the steps that we took at our own campus, they distinguished our approach, and they grew out of our longstanding commitment to global engagement and institutional transformation. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share those thoughts with you as we begin our discussion.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. As a management academic, I'd like to see that as an excellent case study in the application of leadership rather than just the rhetoric of leadership, and also as a case study in leadership as practical service and not simply as glory. I'd now like to hand over to Prof. Tandwa Matembu for his input.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Well, let me do a presentation of it. Yes. I will focus obviously on the topic for this session, identity, culture, and leadership in context. You will realize that I've unscrambled the theme or the topic from what we were given. We were given leadership context, culture, and identity, but I just decided to turn it around and make it identity, culture, and leadership in context. And I'm sorry, contrary to what my dear friend and colleague Patrick said earlier, that maybe identity and context maybe don't quite sit easily together. I want to insert that. That's why I changed the topic that we have been given, because I do think that in the higher education sector, the issue of identity, but what identity, culture, what culture, and leadership for what, is something that we really need to delve into in context. So all of them, I would like to situate them within the context. Identity, I think you can Google all of these things. I'm not presenting a research paper, really. I'm not a sociologist. I'm just looking at all of these concepts as a layperson. Identity, in short, is the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. And I would like us to focus on the thing, because that's what the university is. The university is the thing. And I know in an earlier session, there was a whole discussion about, well, when we lead at a university, we must always remember that we are leading people. But whilst I wouldn't like to oppose that idea of leading people, which indeed is true, it's ultimately about leading people. But as we lead people, we should also think about the thing that the people we lead should continue to be part of, that if this thing is forgotten, then it ceases to exist. And people may continue to exist in a different thing that may not be a university. So for me, the identity in higher education or in a university should first and foremost be about what this thing we call a university is. And then secondly, culture, the ideas, customs, social behavior of a particular people or society. I would want, again, in the context of a university, I would like us to think of culture as ideas, customs, social behavior that cohere with what this thing called a university is supposed to be. I've heard people argue that taking into context the fact of people of different walks of life, backgrounds, cultures, we should infuse this into the university, which happens organically, actually. But we always have to be very careful about infusing all of those different and conflicting, perhaps, ideas, customs, social behavior, patterns, infusing them in such a way that the thing we call university gets completely bastardized and becomes something else that cannot be or cannot any longer be described as a university. So we've got to be very careful about this thing. And I know, and in fact, even at DUT, we subscribe so much to the idea that, which is actually an idea that we borrowed from Pascal Finet, that people are the source of everything we do. Therefore, when we think about identity, as much as people are the source of everything we do, in the same vein, people can make or break a university. If, as Jim Collins would say, if we don't have the right people who are in the right seats and performing their roles right, and we just accept that any person who happens to be a university is a person who will advance the interests of this thing called a university, then we will be mistaken if we think that it's just any person who advances the university. It's the right people who associate with the identity of what a university is, who exhibit the ideas, the customs, and social behaviors that will be associated with this thing we call a university. And then lastly, in my view, leadership should therefore not be about leadership of compromise perpetually at the face of losing the identity of this thing, or people putting management under pressure or leadership under pressure to infuse certain ideas, customs, social behaviors that are not in keeping with the identity of this thing. So my last slide really just says, therefore, the context of the university, which is this thing that we have to defend, and not necessarily just about any individual we find within it who may not be acting in the way we would expect people at a university to act, the norms, the ideas, the customs that we should have. So the context of the university requires people. And as I've said earlier, the right people who are in the right seats and who perform the roles that are supposed to be performed within the university, and they perform them right. So we need those people who will live the values, the principles, the ideas, the customs, and the behaviors that are consonant with what we could call the university culture or institutional culture. And led by a strong and resolute leadership, council, management, and I add students and alumni, because you will agree with me that students are, of course, very energetic and they push whatever boundaries exist within the university. But when they do that, we always have to be careful that the values, the principles, the ideas, the customs are not the ones that will basically eliminate the nature and identity of this thing we call the university, that often sometimes is left with nobody to defend when students are making demands, even prepared to destroy it, to burn it down, when staff members are making demands about salaries and so on, and they are prepared to do anything. When alumni, and these days, a lot of them, because of the death of the job market in this country, you find strident calls for the university to issue tenders to alumni and so forth. It's all about me as a student, me as an alumnus, me as a staff member, at the expense of this thing we call the university. So strong and resolute leadership for me should take the context of the pressures that are put upon our universities in terms of their identity, their culture, which is pretty much universal across the world, about what the university is about, or its identity, its culture. So we need to rededicate ourselves as the leadership to jettisoning a lot of these social behaviors we see now, the customs that are forming and ideas that are really eventually about destroying the nature and identity of a university. So ultimately, we should all be working towards advancing the nature and identity of the university. The university is not your village. The university is not your township. The university is not your church. The university is not your a group that is part of your social persuasions. It is the university. And its identity, as much as there could be changes over the years, its identity, its culture should remain intact. Otherwise, we will have contributed as the leadership in the death of this very invaluable organ of society that we call the university. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Tandwa. I think some of us who may have had similar experiences to you would know in very precise ways what you're talking about. It's certainly true that in leading, one is leading people, and there's a lot involved in leading people, but one is leading people in an institutional context. And there's research that has proved time and time again that institutional cultures, traditions, values, identities are very strong, and are particularly strong in successful institutions, which have their own particular anthropologies, which bring many diverse people into some kind of common vision, common mission. In the case of the university, not only for the institution, but indeed for the public good. So it's very, very important to realize that although people say, and there's a lot of truth to it, that institutions face backwards, without leadership, institutions face their past. They made up of all the things that they used to do that brought them to this point. And at times of change, like we are now in, have been in for a while and maybe will be in for some time to come, and complexity, leadership has to take an institution into the future, but it has to take that institution with that particular set of objectives, duties, social responsibilities, knowledge transmission, knowledge generation project of a university into the future. In that sense, I think somebody said that taking care of those values and those cultures and those traditions is not a worshipping of the ashes of the past, but it's actually about taking the fire and the flames into the future. I'll ask Prof. Pamela Dubé to make her contribution next. Pam, you may metaphorically ascend the rostrum.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And good afternoon to the fellow discussants and to all participants to this session. It's indeed a great opportunity to engage with you on this platform and on this very important topic. The fellow discussants have already dissected the topic in detail in terms of its conceptual framework and applicability. So I would like to focus more on the adaptability and our collective wisdom as a sector, and of course at institutional level in terms of our collective roles. As a start, I just want to emphasize that, adaptability in this contribution is without making assumptions that all universities are equally equipped to respond to rapid changes and crises. However, we all know that higher education is not new to complexities. Even long before the coronavirus hit us, there have been compelling arguments for institutions to become more adaptive, especially given the challenges of uncertain funding, greater competition, increased globalization, as well as developments within the digital technology world, which were already making a case for universities to look at their governance structures and consider how they might set themselves up to better adapt to a fast-changing world market. In South Africa, in addition, we've also had recent student movements that have challenged our thinking about governance, leadership, the curriculum, institutional cultures, and related. Next slide, please. I want to share with you in this presentation, under those 5 points on the right, the impact that COVID has had on the higher education system's ability to carry out the academic agenda. And here I want to share the information I saw from a survey conducted between March and April this year by the International Association of Universities. And then I want to touch on the importance of social solidarity, especially during a crisis, the importance of inclusive recovery. And then four, as much as a lot has been said about a new social compact and or social contract, here I just want to bring in our Chair of Council's favorite, Don Tapscott's notion of a new social contract for the digital age and where all this might all fit in. And then the last point, I just want to end with the emphasis on the interdependencies and importance of leadership agility, also in ensuring that universities as social actors for the public good do not lose sight of their core mission and purpose. So just briefly on the survey, you may wish to look more into it, you can Google it. There's also a recent report there was a recent survey conducted in October, and there should be already a report coming up, and it highlights the digital inequities in the African region, which although the picture may look different now, we as South Africa are still also beset with the same problem, and we will have to continue developing or to enhance our processes to address the potential resulted knowledge gap. The next slide, please. The COVID-19 health crisis has quickly evolved into an economic, social, and cultural crisis that has exposed stark socioeconomic inequalities and inequitable access to resources, as we know, because it also has affected our universities greatly. The pressure for higher education to pivot on its heels and respond to the crisis has served as a catalyst to focus on its core mission and to galvanize support from both its external and internal and external stakeholders and partners to work towards both saving lives and pursuing the academic agenda. There've been fundraising campaigns at various institutions, repurposing of budgets and efforts to ensure that students engage effectively on the emergency online education. So that's where also these campaigns such as No Student Left Behind have come about. And that's a theme that has been really the driving force behind our efforts as a sector. The students have had to move rapidly into online education, and staff members have had to be also adequately trained. As we've heard yesterday, not many staff members also had even equitable access and knowledge really on how to go about with the new forms of having to engage online. While the worst is not over and some students are still on catch-up mode within the extended academic period, judging from the reports that have been shared, that have been submitted to the ministry, and the planning that comes with announcements related to the pandemic protocols, there seems to be clarity of purpose, at least across the sector. Even though progress, of course, has been staggered, we do need to continue to capture what's working and not working as a sector and share that information and use it effectively as we move forward. Data continues to play an important part in how universities adapt and respond. Even more importantly, student success efforts require more engagement with data analytics and keeping track on students at risk and those students who are not able to engage effectively online. I know a lot has been said about surveys that have been done by various institutions. We also have done our own surveys, but we need to keep that information and record it and share it to be able to use it effectively going forward. The next slide, please. I'm not reading the parts in the blocks on purpose. It's just for you to just, see, it just captures some of what I'm talking about. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to read those. I just want to argue that we have the opportunity as a sector to leverage on our collective strengths, assuming, of course, that we have some understanding of what we are good for, what our purpose is, and notwithstanding the demands for differentiation, competition, and related. That we have the capacity and expertise to play an important role in the bigger knowledge generation space, and not just to overcome the current pandemic challenges, but to find the necessary solutions for it. So as we move forward, we need to enhance efforts in inclusion. As mentioned a number of times throughout all the discussions, we are social beings. And the isolation that comes with online engagements can be overwhelming for some students and staff. So the human element is central in all of these engagements. This period has also highlighted the need for increased attention on mental health and gender-based violence and harm interventions at higher education institutions. For instance, in our collaborative work with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, among others, numbers show an increase in requests for counseling for both students and staff. Whilst gender equity and gender-based violence and harm interventions have been brought to the fore during this period in a variety of ways, including by the ministerial task team that has been in consultation with the sector, with all the sector role players recently, we need to continue to be mindful of the multiple demands and roles of many of our women researchers, academics, professional and administrative staff as they work from home. We need to be mindful that some of the environments where they have to seek to connect online are not conducive for effective engagement. Much has been said about the opportunities during crisis for universities and institutions to be resilient and focused on core mission, and the opportunity to collaborate, innovate, and co-create, and how all of these can serve to restore trust again in the role of higher education in society. It's important, however, to emphasize the role of student agency in the collaboration and not to lose sight of the student voice, not only in terms of their academic experience, but also for their input and participation in the engagements with the relevant communities internally and externally. This aspect has been also echoed on discussions of graduateness and the role of co-curricular programs that they play in instilling a sense of belonging and identity and fostering a kind of a unity of purpose. Next slide. The issue of social compact came up as I've mentioned before a number of times, and a number of times also the issue in society, in South African society especially, of the South African Constitution as a social contract that was not inclusive enough to begin with, has been debated over and over again. So I'm not going there here. However, it's interesting to note that as the quick changes brought about by the pandemic propel us at rapid speed into the digital age than we expected, experts like Don Tapscott talk of a new social contract to the digital age. Tapscott himself, a former university leader, and now co-founder and executive chair of the Blockchain Research Institute, and one of the leading authorities on the impact of technology on society and businesses, looks back 10 years from now to a world that required mass mobilization and rethinking, accelerated by the pandemic and the weaknesses of many social masses driven from bottom up and joined by a few enlightened leaders. He talks about how the masses, driven from the bottom up and joined by a few enlightened leaders, as most leaders at the top had vested interests, fought against changes, that all gathered to establish new principles around the expectations, roles, and responsibilities that citizens should have about society. He also quotes Victor Hugo as having said, "There is nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come." And he goes on to say, in our case, there was nothing so powerful as an idea that had become a necessity. So as we get catapulted into the digital age, these principles are worth looking at for our higher education context. And as you will see, the new principles that he suggests emerged during this period are the same principles we've been talking about all this time, and including especially in this in this session. Next slide, please. It is clear that the future of higher education needs rethinking in many ways, including especially how we teach, what we teach, who is teaching it, and who is being taught, and what is their experience. The short-term impact of COVID-19 has long-term consequences that we still need to face as a sector. The lessons learned so far must guide future developments on the sector as a whole. The short-termism of our planning that was raised yesterday by the minister and other speakers needs to be framed by long-term planning and strategies that can be adapted. High-quality research, teaching and learning is indeed required, and investment on conducive infrastructure, redirection of resources needs to continue. Likewise, the equality agenda needs to be supported everywhere in order for the innovation that is to emerge, needed to rebuild our society, to be done by and with all, and not only by those who will be able to afford it. And this is possible under focused and agile leadership, as has been explained, what kind of leadership we would need in going forward. The quotation in that box actually sums all this perfectly. What actions to take in terms of the post-COVID-19 world and what to keep with us. The values that we cherish, the democracy, human rights, and our core values of academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and engagement by students, faculty, and staff, and emphasizing the role of higher education institutions as societal actors for the public good. Thank you, Patrick. I would like to end here for now, and then we will discuss as we go forward. Thank you. So Patrick, can you unmute? I think we can't hear you.
Right, I did unmute it, but clearly I wasn't on target. Thanks, Pamela. Among your many messages, I think something that I was thinking is you've sort of illustrated how institutional leadership is necessary for a university and all its moving parts to be well functioning and fit for purpose. Because unless you have that, then the university as an institution can't really play its role of leadership, knowledge leadership, and other kinds of social leadership in the broader community and in the broader society. as well as the need for the student echelon to be engaged, to buy into and also be engaged in these purposes. Before we go for a second round with our discussants, just to mention two questions or challenges that have come in. Both of them, I think, are what we used to call $50,000 questions. I suppose it would now be $500,000 or $5 million questions. The one which Peter Morris asks is, how does university leadership embed in the institutional life of the institution that culture that is appropriate to carrying out the vision, the mission, the values that the university has put in its document on the website in terms of what it really wants to be with its best foot forward. The other one from Oliver Seal, which stems directly from a whole lot of discussions that have already occurred at this virtual summit, is how do we transform, to use that word, or how do we enable universities to conquer those self-interested or sometimes very parochial or even nefarious agendas that run around the institution, and which Tandwa Matembu touched on, towards some sort of what people have envisaged post-COVID compact with stakeholders in society, where the university can, within the terms of its own mission, play a constructive, progressive role in some of the ways many people expect a university to play that role, as a source of innovation, as a source of economic comparative advantage, as a source of knowledge and people who will take that society forward in various relevant ways. I'll start with Carolyn, Dr. Stefanko, for your thoughts.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful and insightful, and I appreciate the questions that have come in through the chat and the Q&A. I guess what I'm thinking about to respond to Oliver Seal's question, and I appreciate your reframing of it slightly, Patrick. I do think that we're on solid ground when we sort of double down on the mission of the institution, or, you know, and even more broadly, our mission within higher education, which is to create opportunity, to transform lives, as you said, to, or maybe it was Oliver who said, to have this role in terms of not just knowledge leadership, but social leadership. The issue, though, is that as I have experienced this in many countries, and especially in the US, we are really, I'm not sure that we're very good leaders in terms of modeling openness to change. And so while the rest of, in many cases, society, you know, looks at universities as the creator of knowledge, the leaders of change in some ways, of new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, you know, the places of innovation. I'm not sure that we always model that. And so, and I think people get really nervous when they think that we're challenging the mission of the institution. So if we double down on the mission, I think we have to free up the notion that the mission, even for institutions that have existed for a very long time, needs to be understood, needs to be implemented in different ways, depending on the times. And I think that it's incredibly curious to me how, in the time of a global pandemic, the political leadership of the US has, you know, continued to double down on a mindset of isolationism. And to me, the pandemic teaches us, and I know has taught our students, that that's just not tenable. It's not a tenable response that will ensure, you know, public health, never mind, you know, an ability to fulfill the real purposes for which universities exist. So I think for me, the question is, how do you create, and you're right, my presentation was rather practical, but how do you create an environment on campus if you accept the fact that, you know, the mission is the mission? As the leader, you know, I've been hired to support that mission, to embody that mission, and that change is not really welcome, despite what people say. How do you create those opportunities? Well, for one thing, you know, there's the well-worn phrase about not wasting a crisis, right? And so the pandemic does provide that opportunity because, of course, it's a crisis. But I think it's more than that. I think it's about, you know, bringing in, I think it's about identifying champions because they always already exist, but many of them have been silenced over time. I think it's about as I said, bringing in people from outside because I don't know, I had this phrase that someone used with me early in my career, and it really has proved useful as I thought about my own leadership journey. And the phrase is, you cannot be a prophet in your own land, because, you know, just given the way that administrators are viewed in higher education, it's often difficult to be the one who suggests the new idea because often the reaction will be negative just because of the role that you play. So you need to bring in people from outside to create those spaces for conversation, to suggest new ideas. I think you also, as a leader, need to say that you're going to try things and they may not always work. I think as a leader, you need to admit your failures. And that's something that I have done over my career in higher education, because I also think that frees up people. And we have to find new ways of living out our mission that are relevant, as I said during my presentation, to the students who are actually in front of us, who are enrolled in our undergraduate and our graduate programs, for the world in which we live today, for a 21st century education that needs to be global. So thank you for that opportunity.
Yes, Carolyn mentioned the old cliche of strategic thinking, that one should never waste a good crisis. The thing is that cliches are actually sometimes appropriate. They sometimes applicable. And this may be one of the times when that strategic cliche is deeply applicable. If you I have a brief acquaintanceship with teaching a bit of crisis management. And one of the things that happens in a crisis is people are prepared to work in different ways, to do different things, to go outside their particular boxes or their previous job descriptions. And even more relevantly, they prepared to work with other parties or other people or other sectors that they wouldn't necessarily consider cognate to what they do or their function as they see it. And one of the tricks of crisis management is to manage that spirit and that openness to change and new networks, to take that into the recovery. So to take that willingness to work in different ways, to innovate, to work with different stakeholders, to work more closely with other stakeholders and other sectors. If you can take that, if you want to call it that fruit of the crisis, and take that into the recovery period, it is often a way of driving very progressive change and transformation. And it may be that then the COVID, so to say, opportunity provides university leadership with that challenge. I will now hand over to Tandwa.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. Actually, you're doing a very good job of trying to knit together what has come through from the three of us. You did that individually and also piecing together what we've been presenting. And based on what I presented, I would like to point to the importance of what Caroline presented earlier with regard to, for example, global connectedness. In the context of strident calls for decolonization, and we've got to be very careful what we are trying to do with this very important project of decolonization, because if in some of the minds of our staff and students, it should mean getting into a cocoon of sorts, an African cocoon of sorts, then I think we'll defeat the purpose of a university. Advancements in the world, progress in the world, has not been achieved only on the basis of one culture or one intellectual tradition. It's been a complex mix of a number of traditions that have made the world as successful as it is, or made other countries as successful as they are. So the parochialism that you sometimes come across around a number of concepts we hold dear, perhaps in this country and elsewhere, all of that should be thought within the context of what the university's role in society should really be. It should be broad. It should be an open-minded approach to things rather than being closed-minded and being parochial. So that's very, very important. And Pamela reminded us of the importance, and I'm taking just one of the things that she presented, the importance of the student voice. And I think in this day and age, it's very clear that universities realize the importance of developing our students in a holistic way. Indeed, it's no longer just about the programs we offer, imparting the knowledge, doing the research, but it's much more than that. And in my presentation, when I was referring to culture and identity, it's only when you think of a student's education in the broadest sense, in a holistic sense, that you'll begin to focus as part of their education, not just on the engineering that concepts that have to be taught or any other field, but also in terms of, we could think about social behavior, which is quite a challenge amongst our universities. Of course, it is no longer unimaginable that in a university you'll find people who believe in violence as the way to resolve issues. But I'm pretty sure decades ago or centuries ago, universities would have been seen as places where facts and evidence, where reason and debate reigns supreme, as opposed to the force of numbers, and as opposed to the ideas that simply because we live with students, we live with staff, their sheer numbers should determine the course of action in a university. Shouldn't be that. It should be the force of facts and evidence. It should be the force of reason and debate that win the day at a university. So part of our challenge, therefore, is that as much as we could focus on the formal curriculum, there are other parts that we should focus on that make the students' experience a holistic one that will not only help us to produce students who can get into society, influence society, lead society, but also be exemplary in behavior and many other values and principles that we hold dear, not only within universities, but in the broader society. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Right. Thanks, Tandwa. I'm going to move on immediately to Pamela for your comments.
Thank you, Patrick. I think in addressing some of the questions, especially the one on, that came, I think, from Oliver, and actually a number of them that I've just been looking at have got more or less the same thread of how to, be inclusive and galvanize support when there are personal interests within institutions and or personal agendas or roles that people want to pursue, be it in research, and they see whatever movement or disruption that's happening as basically disturbing their progress. I just wanted to address that because that's been one, that's one pet interest of mine also, where I'm always aware, and I wanted to bring it through also in my presentation, that in a time of crisis management, it tends to be normal that people want to protect what they have and what they know, and so it's, I think, in the leadership team to behave not like they have all the toolkit and answers in terms of the way they proceed going forward. But it's how to make sure that, you make use of your teams, the strengths of the multi-stakeholder teams that we can put together. For instance, what happened a lot, or what's been happening a lot throughout, and I think that helped also, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, to emphasize the strengths that come within the research area, for instance, colleagues that were working in area of, vaccines and sharing information and an understanding and making the university or society have an understanding of what this virus was about and what's possible. And basically waylaying in some ways the fears that were coming up. So it's putting those people also at the forefront at the best, in the best way that they can express themselves and in their skills and capabilities, and making use of their strengths. And I think that's come up really, it's not forcing people to all be on the same boat, because we, as social beings, we also come in all our diversities and of course also in our diverse strengths. And I think really my experience within this period has how much it has helped while we were focused on the teaching and learning agenda, but we were also focused on making sure that we use the strengths of the colleagues in the research area, in the support area, and forming across campus kind of multitask stakeholder task teams to pursue areas that would bring together all their strengths, but basically looking at the crisis, at the management of the crisis and finding solutions together. I mean, in terms of some of the discussions that I mean have come across, I don't want to repeat what's been said. I mean, Carolyn, your presentation around the steps that have been taken, I mean, in your environment, and especially in terms of international students, a whole lot of what you said mirrors some of our experiences, especially in the area of student affairs, when we had to deal with students having to leave campus, and the students then that were most vulnerable being international students, and how to be inclusive when making those decisions about students that have to stay behind or students that have to leave, and also listen to them and get to appreciate where they come from and what the vulnerabilities that they come with and how they can be addressed. And come with an open mind of not just saying, no, you cannot, you know, this cannot be done, but also getting them to appreciate the context within which we were operating. But, you know, that whole galvanizing of support and collaboration for us, well, in my context, also extended to making use of the students themselves, the student leadership, getting involved also in, you know, in the communication to other students, and even in some of the interventions, support interventions, you know, around food security and all of that, and just really around their well-being. So basically getting students involved. I mean, in one of the block information that I had in my presentation, I also emphasize how universities were able to use, even through the, you know, the faculties, be it in science, medicine, nursing, really getting students to participate also in the broader society, and basically playing out the, you know, their roles through their offerings, and getting our students in a way, yeah, as advocates, but also practicing their graduateness through sharing in the broader community. Basically, that whole unity of purpose I was talking about. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay. Thanks, Pamela, for yourself and for the other two panelists. Just to assure you, if you haven't had a chance to check on the participants, you are talking to somebody. There's a whole lot of people out there listening, and some of them are indeed sending in some questions which you may be picking up on the chat. There's a Smolanyana question from Bernadette in terms of how COVID has impacted on identity with our institutional contexts. What has been the impact of COVID on our identity? And one could maybe say, yes, and on our culture as well. Another question from Prof. Lulama Makubela, which is kind of, it's a kind of a question about the whole bang shoot, which I guess is Prof. Makubela's normal style. You may have read it, but just without meaning to totally reframe it, how do we balance these competing demands of access, success, epistemological access at a time of rapid massification that we are living through in South Africa currently? Our massification is both a huge success on the one hand, and on the other hand is presenting a whole lot of challenges. What about the student political formations who wish to use the university and its mission in a particular way? The union demands, the academics who often feel left out and having the least power in institutions which are supposed to be about them. And as Lulama phrases it, and executive management who feel they are the true and authentic guardians of the university mission, that the university mission is theirs and that they know best. So how do we mediate and bring some sort of working harmony? We're universities, so we don't expect everybody to agree. We don't even want everybody to agree. That would be awful. But how do we manage these very different competing stakeholders into some kind of functioning that can actually enable the university to play its greater social role, which I alluded to earlier, rather than just ourselves spending all our time working out all our own institutional issues and forgetting that public universities, especially, maybe universities in general, are meant to be champions also of a public good. And society is looking at them for many different kinds of knowledge services, skills services, relevant research, innovation, economic competitive advantage, and in some way modeling a better future society, especially in a country like ours. I'll ask Carolyn to tackle it from her position of having a view from an international comparative aspect.
Thank you, Patrick. You know, I think that one of the opportunities and the burdens of leadership is managing these competing stakeholders. And I think that's probably always been the case, but I think that the pandemic has accelerated the difficulties. And in all of my engagement with colleagues in other countries and with all the presidents and chancellors I know in the US, you know, there's a huge burnout factor right now. And not to say that, you know, faculty or students or whatever should feel sorry for us. It's not about that, but it's just become so much more difficult. And a lot of that is due to a factor that we really haven't discussed today, which is the tremendous financial strain that the pandemic has placed on individuals, on families, on businesses, and on universities. My colleagues in Australia are going through a redundancy program and are fighting for their jobs. I mean, it's affecting everyone. And so, you know, I think that when I start a new leadership role at an institution, and I have moved about, I often do what a lot of people do. I go on what we tend to refer to as a listening tour. And I remember some, you know, just incredible moments that stand out for me in my listening tour. And some of these are, you know, one-on-one meetings with other leaders, with groups of faculty. In my last role, when I became president, I had wine and cheese socials is what we called them at my home. And I invited small groups of faculty, no more than 25. And I did that for a long time. And, you know, one of the real standout moments for me was a faculty member who said to me at one of those wine and cheese socials, you know, I just can't imagine why, you know, you would want to live in this other state where you came from, a state within the United States. And it was just such a pivotal moment for me, because I thought, wow, you know, this person can't imagine why I would live in another state. I've lived in other countries. And this is a person who I'm looking to as a member of the faculty to work with me and us and to lead this global engagement, the implementation of this global engagement strategy. And how is this going to work, you know, when this person can't imagine living outside of New York? So I do think that in many cases, the role of leadership is not actually to come up with the ideas, but it's to provide perspective, right? And how do you do that? I've already given some examples of how you do that. But I think for many members of a university community, it's through professional development. And now I'm talking about staff and faculty. So invest in professional development. whether it's becoming involved in a professional association, whether it's having the opportunity to teach at a partner institution in another country or even another place within your country, all of that creates perspective. And I know for me, those experiences have really been life-changing. I also think that as much as possible, and others have mentioned this, create this cross-stakeholder engagement. And I love this thought that, that was mentioned earlier about taking advantage of the crisis and the new kind of networking that goes on, and don't lose that. And so I think purposefully bringing people together on a diversity, equity, and inclusion university-wide task force that, is not just faculty, it also includes students and staff. Well, that's kind of what we expect, but what about alums? Maybe have some alums be part of it because they're an important stakeholder group. What about members in the community? Maybe have them be part of it. I mean, mix it up. In terms of your leadership teams, we tend, I'm not as certain about this in South Africa, but in the US, we tend to have, the same people we meet with all the time. And not surprisingly, they report to us, they tell us what they think we want to hear. It's just not the best way to engage others and to make decisions. So invite other people in. So those are the thoughts that come to my mind at the moment. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. That's a good start. I like the idea about an emphasis on ongoing professional development. Tandwa, I'm passing the ball for you to run with it a bit more.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yes, the issue of stakeholder interests is a challenging one. I guess in every other institution or organ of society. And that's why for me, it's important that we are clear about the identity and the culture that is relevant for a university. That's why for me, it's very important that leadership looks very much in a focused way on the values and the principles, that not just the leadership as the leadership of at the level of governance and management, but all levels of leadership, including student leadership, needs to rededicate themselves to those values and principles. And for me, the competing interests, once we have all these shared values and principles, I'm expecting the competing interests to wane. They will always be there. Human beings are human beings. But focusing on a goal bigger than all of us, which is a goal about the university itself, as I called it, this thing that sometimes is left to fend for itself when it actually cannot fend for itself, but people should be there to fend for it. So once there is a common vision, a rededication to what the university is, to what it is about, to what the relevant values and principles are, I do think that those competing interests might get to converge into something that really advances the university rather than the interests of the stakeholders. And in that way, I believe we'll be able to sustain our universities into the future. We'll be able to leave a legacy, not about what we extracted out of the university, but the contributions we really made to enhance the influence of our universities way into the future, and for the benefit of even those who will not even be born in the next 100 years. So that would be my comment on the issue of stakeholders. And maybe I should also add that as much as I know that the job of leaders does sometimes look like it is political, but I think in an academic institution, there is really not enough space for leading as if you are leading in a political environment. And if you begin to treat leadership in a university as if it requires some sort of political leadership, I think that's where things go wrong. Because as we all know, unfortunately, the current way of life in a political environment is one where facts and evidence, reason and debate are not always taken as most important in decision making. But in a university, that should be the case. It can't be that because it's the unions, it's the students, they want what they want, then they shall get what they want. If they want what they want, and it's about advancing the interests of the university, sometimes you get people fighting against something as simple as you need certain minimum qualifications for academics. And you now have to, maybe if you are the leader that I'm saying we should not be, you play politics with that. But ultimately, if your staff do not have the minimum qualifications, are not producing the work that is expected, that will diminish the university and will make it something other than what it should be. And again, one could argue that, no, but you are not looking at the interests of the people that happen to be there. But we are all sojourners at any given university. And we should not spell the end of the university as it should be into the future for generations to come, simply because we happen to be here now and we've got to take care of each other. We should take care of the university, and our interests as staff, as students, as management should recede into the background. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Yes, you know, the work of Nassim Taleb, who talks about fragility and resilience, came to my mind during your contributions, Tandwa, especially when you ask who speaks for and who defends not only the idea of the university, but the institution itself. I spent several years of my life in government, in the Gauteng provincial government and later in national government. And there were often resistance to various things that government policies, government programs, even to the extent of demonstrations, demarches. I was at one stage a director general, and I would have various stakeholders storming into my office and demanding certain things. But I never felt a sense of fragility. I know there are things like failed states and so on, but I never felt that the very existential idea of government was at risk, that we would be overwhelmed. In my youth, which is quite a long time ago, I remember being part of a group of students who stormed a vice-chancellor's office and basically threw him out, which was quite dramatic then, wouldn't be that unusual today. And I remember how we saw the university, how we saw it as so establishment, so powerful, something that was always there, that had been there already when we were born, would continue to be there when we die and would service the generations. And perhaps that's how it should be and will be. But having been a sent as an administrator to two universities, University of Limpopo, and then over a decade later to VUT, and also having been the chair of council of a university at a particularly fragile period, it's hard to explain to the stakeholders. As Carolyn said, you're not saying that people should feel sorry for you, but it's hard to explain to all those burgeoning, competing stakeholders, students, trade unions, academics, people who want business from the university, legitimately or illegitimately, other stakeholders, parents, sponsors, economic ministries expecting patents and innovations to pour out of our doors, local communities expecting to get some benefit, and saying to them, you know, hang on, we trying to keep this ship afloat. We trying to manage this thing. We trying to retain the strengths and virtues that we have. We trying to strategically prioritize, work out with our limited resources how to apply them, how to keep this whole thing in balance and going forward, if you are inclined that way, in a progressive direction. And I think that it's difficult. As Karen says, it comes with the territory. Tandwa says, we must watch out. We don't want our universities transformed into sort of big NGOs that have actually forgotten what their specific precise role in a society is. But it certainly is a leadership and management challenge. And I think it's come out in a number of conversations that have occurred during the summit. I'll ask Pam to comment on the questions and on the contributions of the other panelists.
Yes, thanks, Patrick. Indeed, I mean, the glue that I think holds it together is foregrounding the principles and the mission and the values and all of that. But I think in addition, it's really, the importance of communication and being ready to listen to the various stakeholders as much as their interests are competing, but really getting to appreciate where they are coming from. As Professor Tembu said, it's not about having to consent and getting them what they want. We still shouldn't be losing sight of what the actual processes and procedures for getting, for arriving at what they need, but also, you know, be in a position to give them the bigger picture in terms of where we are and what some of the implications of what and what the implications would be of some of what they are asking for or what they're requesting at that stage. Caroline talked about the financial situation in our institutions, and currently it's not just our institutions, it's across the whole country. There've been very serious discussions around tuition fees increase and what that would mean. Already the student voice is coming up, slowly but strongly against tuition fee increase. It's the same thing with the unions. There are expectations that there should be negotiations and there should be considerations given to the workers and what they have gone through and the state of the economy and the fact that they also need to be considered in terms of salary increases. But if the approach is to say that there shouldn't be any salary increases, then what the implications of that would be And you need to be able to discuss that with the role players from both sides, be it the unions or the council or at government level. So it's really all these conflicting kind of messages, but I think it's about really going back to presenting the bigger picture and getting back to the glue that holds basically the university together in terms of mission and values. And even if we may not always agree even about exactly those, but at least the trust that came about from a collective kind of engagement. The other thing is really I know, I think it's Benedict raised again the issue of identity and how to make sure that that gets fostered or continues to hold even during the time of COVID. And I think really, I mean, yeah, well, there are multiple identities in a way that come with the kind of roles that people, you know, have to shift in between within institutions sometimes. And sometimes you get a sense there's just one identity that we want to drive as a kind of a brand identity in terms of the institution and the name of the institution, what it stands for, what its history is. It's how then we work around that brand identity. And in the programs, I mean, you talked about continuous professional development that happens, that colleagues still feel, you know, valued. There is training that still continues. And then it's all and the university contributing towards that. Yesterday, there was mention of conflict management as something that universities need to look at. But also just training around the issues that are happening right now and around mental health and counseling and when it comes to staff members and students, and especially when it comes to students also ready to continue with the core curricular programs. I mean, we haven't stopped. I mean, from my area in terms of making sure that the kind of core curricular programs that we're driving now are relevant to the context and the needs that the students have currently to help empower them, have them best able to tackle the issues that are facing them. There have been issues even in terms of student governance structures, not, for instance, being addressed timely. You know, student representative councils either requested for or used the opportunity. I mean, talking for, you know, about politics, some student representative councils used the opportunity to want to stay perpetually in office. And that has had to be looked at really through serious lens of this is how, you know, this is the framework that guides student governance. There may be need for flexibility and requests, for instance, from council and so on to consider some requests, but everything still works within the framework that has been set and still in a consultative manner that should be, you know, opening up for more democratic participation of the other stakeholders and especially, you know, students in this instance. So I think for me, it's really about, yeah, making sure that that brand identity also is part of the glue that holds everything together. Driving it forward, newspaper articles about the achievements, carrying on with recognition of academic achievements is something that actually also encourages colleagues and see that they are valued, or encourages students. And that's the brand identity that we shouldn't be also losing as institutions, and making sure that we are there for our colleagues and students during this time. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Pam. We've probably beaten this one somewhat to death, but there's a topic that has been slightly touched on in this conference, but not really examined, and that's not simply leadership in practice or in action, but leadership development. how should we be actually going about developing leadership? If leadership provides some sort of answer to many of these wicked challenges that we're facing. And it could, of course, be management leadership on the side of academics who are transforming from academics into now becoming managers and executive managers, which is a different mindset, no longer involves specialization. In fact, if anything, involves generalization of skills. Other kinds of distributed leadership, not necessarily represented by having officers and personal assistants. Student leadership. How can we, and how do we get our institutions to lead without losing their own focus and mission? Carolyn, I'm reading your CV. It seems you know a thing or two about developing leaders. Maybe you could share some of the contemporary or state-of-the-art techniques. You did allude to professional development. How do we, and I know the USA has been in this business a bit longer than most jurisdictions in terms of self-consciously, through a set of specific actions, creating a pool of leaders that can then, as it were, ascend into those positions in your higher education institutions. What could we be doing to cultivate leadership at various stages? I think where we do it at the moment is when it's already happened, when people who have had successful academic careers suddenly find themselves as heads of schools or deans, and suddenly need to understand how labor relations or labor law works, or how finance works, or how to do strategic planning, or how to even communicate effectively beyond their own discipline. That's where we tending to intervene. At least that's where HELM started. But it may be that there are more systemic and effective ways that we can begin to cultivate and self-consciously develop higher education leadership. I'll ask you, Carolyn, to contribute to that.
Thank you so much. And you know, my journey has been all about professional development. I mean, professional development for myself, and I regularly talk about that. And as president, I continue to have a coach. I continue to seek out mentors. I continue to read things and take classes. And so I think the first step is to use yourself as an example that you're not a finished product, that it is a lifelong process, because as you change institutions, as the circumstances change, and as has been mentioned, the pandemic is certainly a good example of that. As the students who come to us change because of our desire to recruit a different kind of student body, or just the changing nature of who's able to access higher education, we have to be different kinds of leaders. So, I mean, I think the easiest way to do this is to not do it alone, right? In terms of being practical. So I think that working through global, national, professional associations is often the way, and HELM is certainly a good example of this, or consortiums, because it's hard to have that perspective, when if you're only really putting together programs based on what being at your institution. And so you right away, you broaden the perspective when you think about working through a consortium or a professional association. I'm going to put a plug in, and Oliver Seal will not be surprised here, for the International Leadership Association. I've been a member for a very long time, and I'm on their board of directors. And so, it's beyond South Africa or the US or any country. There are also organizations you can join with thousands and thousands of members from around the globe who are really devoted to learning more about leadership, to providing that kind of guidance. So even if your university isn't doing much, there's a way even for you to do something as an individual. But I think that for those of us who have gotten tapped on the shoulder and have had these opportunities to study and to lead change, because that's, in my view, what leadership is all about, you know, there's a real opportunity to give back. And so, you know, later on today, I'm going to be leading a session at a seminar for new deans. And, you know, to provide some perspective from the panelists about what they thought when they first became deans, and now that they're provosts and chancellors, you know, how things look to them and what they expect, you know, from deans. But it's, I think we have to give back. I think we have to open the door. And I think we have to not just talk about the problems, because I do want to underscore the financial challenges that institutions are facing. And I loved the point that was made earlier about, you know, these institutions may not always be there. There are many universities that have closed in the United States, and probably more are in the process of having to close or merge because of the impact of the pandemic on finances and the demands of students for a return of their tuition or their residence hall fees or that sort of thing. So it's easy to get focused on all the negatives, on the, you know, the difficulty of managing all the stakeholders and how those difficulties have increased because of the pandemic. I was on a panel, though, that I helped to organize a couple of years ago. And what we realized, what I learned from that panel of other leaders, is that we don't talk enough about the joys of leadership. And I probably have fallen down in that regard on our session today as well, in that respect. And I think that there just isn't a great pipeline of people who, if tapped on the shoulder, are willing to consider professional development and trying something out, even in the distributed model of leadership, which I certainly, you know, support and know that we need at universities. So I think we have to talk more about the joys. And for me, you know, when I think about, as many have mentioned today, what really is our purpose? For me, the purpose has always been about serving students. And when I first started to become, you know, to take on different roles in academic administration, I remember a president chancellor who I went to, and I said, oh my gosh, I have to make these decisions right away. How do I know what to do? And he said to me, you know, Carolyn, if you always think about the impact on students and what will best serve students, you probably won't go too far wrong. And so when I think about the joys, the biggest joys of being a leader, and that's a leader in the classroom as a professor, it's a leader as a president, it really has been the impact that you have on students. And that's both at the individual level, when you can use your access to people to make a difference in somebody's life and solve a problem for them. And I know at big places you can't do that very often, but boy, it's really great when you can. But it's also to have an impact on policies that will serve many. So thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Tandwa, some thoughts on leadership development from your side after your long and glorious career?
Yes, we have an important role as the leadership in higher education, not only to think of leadership as the preserve of maybe ourselves and those who are coming after us, and perhaps not just the union leadership, the student leadership, but begin to think of how we could infuse some of the ideas of leadership from very early on. I know that we always wish for so many things to be embedded in our curricula, and I know we could not always do that. But there are so many other ways we could inspire leadership in our young people in the manner we do things. Even when we do things that they don't necessarily like, but that we know will make them grow as leaders, even if they might only realize that after 5 years, 10 years, when they start their working careers. We do have that responsibility. We've got to demonstrate, and I will go back to what I said earlier in terms of the values and principles, in terms of the culture that we inculcate within our institutions. So in as much as leadership may not be in every other module, but in the manner we manage, in the manner we engage with the different stakeholders, there must be firmness, there must be adherence to the values and the principles, and through that, a number of our young people would learn quite a lot. Hard as it may be to some of us who find ourselves in very, very difficult positions, find ourselves facing masses of students, student protests, and having to address all of that. But I believe we will achieve quite a lot by leading as examples of how leaders in society could actually promote the values and principles, promote the idea, promote our institutional culture as a unique organ of society that our universities should be. So, and I do think that as part of this, especially with the student leadership, exposure to, which is again, something that goes back to Caroline's presentation, exposure to many other environments helps quite a lot. And I know that in this country, there is a popular project by SRCs of, they call it benchmarking, and they go all over the place. Sometimes not so much to learn as to enjoy themselves. And we need to find ways of recapturing or repurposing such activities so that they have exposure within perhaps the bigger African continent, other continents, so that as they return, even though the difficulty, of course, with student leadership is that it's very ephemeral. I mean, a year, what can you do in a year? In fact, that's another challenge I've always posed to our young leaders, that this practice of having only 1 year leadership periods is not helpful to them, because they are facing people like us who have decades and decades of experience, and we can pretty much tell what they might want to say before they say it, and we probably have experienced it many times before, and they are coming in, young as they are, thinking that in a year they are going to change a lot. So if we do find ways of inculcating the right ideas of leadership even before they come into the SRC, and in fact, we could even impose as one of the conditions for ascending to a leadership position, some training that they would have undergone, or some exposure, or some community engagement they would have been involved in. I think that will begin to give us the kinds of leaders who have the exposure to other environments, who have shown commitment to a number of social causes that might be there within the institution, and have taken leadership in all of that. So I'm really suggesting a very holistic approach to leadership that will allow our young people especially to get exposed to a number of environments, a number of maybe intellectual traditions even, that if they come back with all of that, I have no doubt that it would change the way they do things. In particular, I mean, having been to China several times, and so many of us have been, you would notice when you go to universities there, how well organized they are, how embedded the students are in the life of the university through what we might just call extramural activities, sports, culture, and so forth. And I think those are the kinds of approaches and levels of exposure that our students in South Africa should also get, in order for the doi not to be the only form of excitement that is there within the university. We should see them in all sorts of extramural activities where they could be equally excited as they are excited when there's a doi. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Tandwa. Pam, you have the final bite of the cherry for 3 minutes.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm not going to repeat what colleagues have said, especially what Prof. Tembo has said. But I just want to emphasize that in that whole holistic approach to leadership development, that we do not lose focus on women leadership and in terms of building that pipeline of women leadership, that we are not anymore, as we go forward, in a position where there is a lot of noise about the first woman leader to be doing this in that area, or that is just leadership. It's not so much about now it's a first woman to be doing this, because we have enough women in the pipeline that have been trained. So I think I just wanted to add that, and yeah, and leave it at that. Thank you very much, Patrick. Right.
Well, I guess that's it. We've had a very fulsome 2 hours. We've covered a lot of ground. We've tried to answer some of the questions and challenges that have come to us in the way things do in this virtual time, through the chat and the Q&A lists. I think I've learned a little bit, and that's always a lesson that when you're talking about leadership, there's always more to learn, and there's always more to understand. Carolyn, I was a bit amused when you said one should use oneself as an example. I think my whole life I got chucked into something of which I had no idea what was involved or how to approach it. And that kept on happening. I don't think I've ever attended a leadership course or facilitation in my life, which led me to this interest in leadership as my academic field, and to leadership development in terms of my current association with HELM. So I'm sure we'll be continuing to call on you, on yourselves and other people who can advise us how we can best use what resources we have to take your various advices and to start cultivating leaders in a more distributed way, in a more affirmative way, bearing in mind issues like gender and associated issues, that we can really bring about the kind of leadership reservoir pool spirit. I was really interested in the joy of leadership thing. It really struck me. Maybe we should project leadership as slightly more joyful, because I think in South African higher education, we project it as quite doleful, quite a responsibility, quite a thing that you have to, commit and bear. Perhaps there is some joy in leadership, and I believe, if I think about it, there is. So we need to balance the joys of leadership with the responsibilities, the burdens of leadership. We need to celebrate leadership without celebrating toxic leadership. and without showing leadership as something that involves a higher salary and ordering people around, which is also, I think, should I call it a colonial or merely traditional trope in which leadership often presents itself. I'm not saying leadership shouldn't have some authority, but I think the authority should be earned and not simply bestowed with a title. Yes, so this is the end of our session. Again, panelists, thank you very much for your intellectual capital, which I am still mentally poring over. I hope that other people who faithfully attended also benefited. What I think will happen now is that we will disappear and there will remain a link which you can press in order to be taken back to the main conference events Mobi. Thank you all and go well.
Thank you so much.